Today's guest, Clay Risen, is a member of the Society of American Historians, an editor and reporter for the New York Times, and the author of The Red Scare, Blacklist, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. Welcome to the show, Clay.
Thanks for having me.
Why don't you start with giving us a little bit of summary about the book and let us know when it's available for purchasing.
Yeah, so Red Scare is the story of the period of anti-communist fervor after World War II. The story that I tell begins in 1946 and goes up to 1957, roughly, with some glances back to the 1930s and also forward into the 60s. It's very much the story about why the Red Scare happened when it did and why it took the shape that it did. You know, I was inspired by an observation that someone made that, Britain after World War II had as much or more of a spy problem as we did with Soviet spies. France and Italy had much larger communist parties than we did, and yet those countries didn't experience anything like what the United States went through in terms of really going into this period of mass hysteria where anybody who could be pinned as somehow subversive or potentially a secret communist, or let alone out of the closet communist, or even just having some guilt by association affiliation with a communist or with someone who had been determined by the federal government to be a radical. And those terms were very vague. And so ultimately, thousands of people were swept up in this, whether it was through congressional committee hearings or PTA investigations or book bans at public libraries. The deployment of the Red Scare, not just at the federal level, not just through Congress, but at all levels of American government and society. It was pretty mind-boggling that this could happen. And so the book really charts through the big names, the Rosenbergs and Alger Hiss and, of course, Joe McCarthy, but also a lot of people that were everyday Americans who experienced the Red Scare because maybe they had affiliated at some point with the wrong people, or they simply ended up in the crosshairs of someone who was determined to find communists. And so I tell their stories as well, because I wanted to communicate that this was something that, while maybe not every American was directly affected, every American was aware of it, and millions of Americans were in one way or the other affected by it.
I've got so many questions for you because really I'm excited for this. This is right up my alley, and I read the book. And many times when I'm reading books, especially in this sphere, sometimes the way they're written are minorly pedantic, or they're covering subjects that, though the Red Scare is an older topic, they cover older topics that maybe sometimes, if you're not really interested in the subject material, are hard to get into. But what I really liked about the book was exactly that you covered not just the big names like Alger Hiss, but also, the everyday people, because this is one of the things about times like that, and even potentially times like we're going through today, is that when people decide that they have this fear of this other, the fear that's instilled in them through not understanding exactly who their enemy is, the enemy within of sorts, that it leads to a paranoia that really can take a society and dismantle it, take a government and dismantle it. So a lot of the stuff that you talked about with the lower level people, and then all the way up to Oppenheimer, obviously, which was kind of like the big, one. If you watch the movie, it's a part of the movie. A lot of people weren't a huge fan of the Oppenheimer movie because it was less about the bomb and more about him and what happened to him. There's a lot of parallels, I think, that we can see with what's going on today, with today's administration. And I look at the connections of Roy Cohn to McCarthy, Roy Cohn to Donald Trump, and the fact that Donald Trump even mentioned that Roy Cohn was his mentor. And then Roger Stone, of course, taught by Roy Cohn as well, who Roger Stone, a friend of Donald Trump's. Would you be able to make some parallels from McCarthy to kind of the Trump and JD Vance that's going on nowadays?
Oh, could I? When I set out to write this book, which was I've been working on this for a long time. This is not something that I just cooked up because of the news. But it was always very interested in this as a history and a story of history, and I think it's important in that regard. And the book is that it's a book of history, but I feel like actually, in a lot of ways, I wrote a book about current events because
Hmm.
every day there is a news story that echoes either in a very small, specific way or in a broad, thematic way the past experiences in the Red Scare. And just to give some examples, and sort of goes to your point, but I'll narrow into that. A couple of weeks ago, the Department of Education set up a hotline for parents and I guess concerned citizens, students, to rat on their teachers if they thought their teachers were, in this case, dabbling in, I don't know, the wicked DEI boogeyman, whatever that is. And the exact same thing happened during the Red Scare, where parents and teachers were encouraged to go to either the federal government or their local state level, or the FBI or the American Legion, whoever, and rat out teachers and say, I think this teacher is a communist. But very rarely was there any reason to really think that the teacher was a communist. What they were doing was maybe talking about civil rights in a way that the parents didn't like, or talking about women's rights or labor rights, or just things that, sure, communists probably did agree with. We know, progressives generally agreed with. But in the Red Scare, those things were taken as not just proxies, but evidence of a subversive attitude, a subversive stance, and ergo a communist stance. And so then once people were tagged as subversives or potential radicals, there's no end to what the investigations and invasions of privacy, where they would go. I mean, you'd be lucky to keep your job, but even if you did, the FBI or a local police force, they would start overturning your life and looking for evidence. Were you a communist? Because there was this belief that security is the most important thing, and everything has to be taken to the max. So, I think that's one parallel. Another one, and I think this is more the direct kind of McCarthy himself and McCarthy's tactics in some of the things we see today. I'm reminded of back in the summer when there was the whole its own hysteria around Haitian refugees in Springfield, Ohio, eating cats or dogs or whatever it was, domestic pets. And two things that J.D. Vance in particular said. He was being interviewed, and these were two different instances. But he was being interviewed, and someone said, well, look, you have endorsed these claims, some specific claims about this, and they are demonstrably wrong, right? And how do you justify that? And his answer was, well, it's not my job to say what's right and wrong. I'm just repeating what my constituents say. It's your job as the media to check what's being said. And, essentially just abrogating any responsibility to truth or to responsibility itself as a politician. And that's, of course, something that McCarthy would always fall back on. Right. And he would say, all I'm doing is revealing the secrets, and it's up to you as the media to parse through that. And of course, what he was doing was serving up lies and exaggerations and misstatements. And the idea that he had no responsibility in there, well, that's a common tactic running from McCarthy up until today. But there was another thing. In a separate interview, Vance was asked more or less the same question. And this time he said, well, look, it doesn't actually matter whether Haitians are eating dogs, right? What matters is the overall point that immigration is bad, that we need to make radical changes, in our society, in the way that we treat immigrants, the way that we allow immigrants into our country. And so if there's the small lie in the service of this bigger goal, well, that's acceptable. And first of all, it was brazen and striking how brazen that is as a statement, right? But it's also exactly what McCarthy and what McCarthy's supporters said. There were a lot of people who looked at McCarthy and said, well, I know he's lying, but the point is that he's an anti-communist. And even if he's wrong about there being, for example, 200 spies in the State Department, well, the goal here is to make sure there are no spies in the State Department. So it's okay for him to lie or to exaggerate or misstate because he's on the right team. And so it just really struck me when I heard that from Vance, because again, it's exactly the same thing that you saw from McCarthy. And I think anytime you have someone who's trying to make a demagogic stand, trying to alienate and demonize the other, the notion that there is a responsibility to truth kind of goes out the window. And we saw it then, and I think we're seeing it now.
Yeah, and one of the things that I just recently saw as well, I pointed out to my viewers, is the Epstein's client list nowadays has become this idea that there's these names of specifically people you don't like, not your people, as we well know that Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein were very good friends for a very long time. But the thing that struck me really as just absolutely crazy was after this recent batch of supposed information was released, which had already been released, is heavily redacted. It was nothing new. They did this whole dog and pony show of bringing influencers in and waving the binders around. And initially, people were very upset. Even people within Trump's own camp, his own supporters, seemed pretty upset about it. But then I saw, as Dan Bongino became a part of the FBI, he released a statement, and many comments underneath were, well, what are we going to do about the Epstein's files? And one comment in particular said, we don't care about seeing the files anymore. We just want to see arrests. And I was like, that is Red Scare.
Yeah. And, McCarthy did something very similar. And, one of the ways that McCarthy was so successful was that he laid claim to having access to information that no one else had access to, secret files. He would often talk about his army of loyal Americans who worked in the government or had access to information that no one else did. And they would funnel him this information. And then he would get up and say on the floor of the Senate or in front of the media, I have this information. I have documents, right? He was always obsessing over documents. He loved to be photographed with a briefcase with pieces of paper flowing out of them. And whenever reporters would ask and say, hey, yesterday you said you would reveal these documents. And, when you got out to the floor of the Senate, and what you talked about was not really anything surprising. And, he would punt and he would say, well, I'll talk about it later. We'll get to it. And just in the same example, just in a parallel with what you're talking about today, at the end of the day, it became clear that it really didn't matter to his core supporters that there really were documents. It was that this whole performance was a way to go after their enemies. And to a certain extent, whoever he determined was an enemy, right? If he would say, the State Department is full of communists, then his followers would listen to anything he had to say about that. And it was almost window dressing for him to say, I have evidence. It was more the performance. And I think what they hoped was the results of, seeing people just marched out of the State Department.
Yeah. And that's what they want, right? It's like you said, it's visceral. They don't care so much about whether or not the person has actually committed a crime. What they believe is that they've done something that they disagree with already. And if it can be proven in some other manner that potentially they did this, because it's already set. The precedent is set for them that this person has done something bad before, so therefore they could have done this as well. And having them, pulled out is and put on parade or on trial is just like you said, the window dressing for them to be removed. The end result.
Yeah, the thing for McCarthy, and also the House Un-American Activities Committee, for them it was the power of the subpoena and the ability to more or less legally force people to appear in front of their committees and to answer pretty demeaning questions and certainly invasive questions. And it almost didn't matter whether their answer was, I've never been a communist, I'm not going to talk about my past. The fact that they were there was enough often to derail their lives. There was a woman who was a retired judge she was the first person that McCarthy named after his campaign began, after he said, I have 200, I have a list here of 200 names. He called this woman who wasn't actually charged with, or he never charged with being one of the people on the list. I mean, right from the beginning, he was sort of careening all over the place. But he said, oh, she used to work for the federal government and there's a lot of sketchy stuff in her background. And her name was Dorothy Kenyon. And she came down from New York. She released a statement, said, I have no idea what he's talking about. I'm not a communist. I've never been a communist. And she was very open about her past and all that. But simply because she was called, she lost a lot of the contract work that she was doing in semi-retirement, sort of legal advising. By the time it became clear that McCarthy had simply pulled her name out of a hat and decided she was an easy target, he had already moved on to other people. And when she testified in her defense, he wasn't there that day. And, he was meanwhile out and talking to the press and not really caring that he had derailed her life.
When you say that she was so open with what she was talking about, it almost starts that way, right? Like the first person brought up is the person that comes up and says, well, yeah, there's nothing wrong with having communistic values, or there's nothing wrong with having known somebody that was a communist or been to a party meeting. Oppenheimer kind of had that thing, right? Where it was like he had claimed he had been to a party, his brother and I think his girlfriend at one point were card-carrying members. But he said, hey, I went there, I looked at what they thought, I didn't completely agree, sue me, right? And now we see the same thing in the Epstein files, where if you could potentially get to a point where just like the left liberals, Truman, many liberal senators and stuff joined in the Red Scare because they were afraid to be attached to these people that have this taint. You can almost see the same thing happening here, because in even almost a worse way, when you start attacking the left and Democrats and specifically the LGBT community as being groomers, and then you have somebody that comes out and says, yeah, I've done drag story time, or one of these other things that these people have, vilified as being bad for society and bad for your children, that the first person might get up there and say, sure, I've done this one or two things, but the moment that their lives are ruined, every person after that now starts to put distance between themselves. And that's a very insidious thing.
It is. And another thing that happened during the Red Scare was, a lot of people simply said, no, I'm not going to talk about my past. I'm not, and look, I mean, some of them had good reason to say that because, maybe they had been a member of the party or they had affiliated with a communist front, and they understood, look, there was nothing illegal about being a communist. So technically they should have felt perfectly fine saying, yes, I was a member of the party in 1935 and, left, and that's it. But they understood that it was toxic to say that. But claiming some version of privacy, either through the First Amendment, freedom of speech, or the Fifth Amendment, the freedom from self-incrimination, these things were considered themselves incriminating. If you said, you can't make me talk about my past, well, then you were targeted. I mean, you were defined as, that was as good an admission of guilt. There was a teacher, I talk about this one guy who was, he was the math teacher, chair of the math department at Bronx Science here in New York. It's an elite public school. And he was considered one of the best math teachers in America. And he was called down to McCarthy's committee, and they asked him, were you a member of the Communist Party? Have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And he said, look, yeah, I don't have to tell you that. That's my business. And, I'm not going to come here and talk about my political views in front of someone who I know is coming after me. That's not American. And, well, he went back to New York and he was fired from his job and essentially kicked out of teaching. And, does it matter whether he was a communist or not? No one ever accused him of teaching communism in the classroom, which itself, I mean, we can debate whether that was a good thing or not, but he was nothing but a great teacher. And but this was the way it worked back then. And one of the things that I really worry about going forward is, so far, so much of the attention has been on what the Trump administration is doing, and rightly so. But there are also a lot of people in the House in particular, who I think I would be very surprised if over the next 6 months or year, we didn't see them really starting to deploy the subpoena power to harass and go after the presidents or their own supposed enemies, and using that subpoena power in a way to construct enemies of the people, right? To say, well, this is somebody who, we're going to have a panel on left-wing radicals in schools, and we're going to call a bunch of teachers, and we're going to embarrass them, and we're going to make them answer these degrading questions about their private lives in order to make some point about the radicals in schools. And don't believe for a second that you can't find 5 teachers out there who, maybe they have particular views. Again, nothing wrong with that. Certainly not illegal. But you call a bunch of people out into a dog and pony show, a degradation ceremony, using the subpoena power, and it starts to get really dangerous, because it only takes a few examples like that for everybody else to shut up and start to circle their own wagons, leave their professions. That's where civil society really starts to break down. And to some extent, we're seeing it now in certain sectors, the legal sector, where Trump is going after certain law firms, and many law firms are not standing up to defend them. They are quiet because they don't want to be targeted. And now it's happening at that level. We're going to see it. I worry we're going to see it at the individual level. And the reason I worry is precisely because I spent so much time studying this as a historical fact. And it was so easy to do at the time. The House Un-American Activities Committee, in particular, used and abused the subpoena power for 10 years, 20 years. I mean, it's went on for a long time. And it's frightening.
One of the things about the math teacher that you're talking about too, didn't they remove his geometry books from
Yes.
libraries around the world? Yeah,
Great
right?
example. Yeah. So, one of the things that happened, again, I mean, these parallels just pop up, is that book bans were very common during the Red Scare. And there were lists of books that circulated, some of them very irresponsible. They're all irresponsible, but some of them without really any basis. In fact, a lot of them completely ridiculous. Dashiell Hammett, the author of The Maltese Falcon, was at one time a communist. The Maltese Falcon is not a communist book by any stretch. It's just a good detective novel. And that's how we see it today, and the basis of a great movie. But all of his books were removed from school libraries and from government libraries, State Department libraries around the world. And in some cases, the books were burned, which is symbolic. These weren't big ceremonies, but people were just getting rid of books and they burned them. And that does mean something. I think it's really indicative of where the mindset was. We need to completely destroy this text. And so to your point, yeah, so Julius Hlavaty was the guy's name. He was a Slovak immigrant. His geometry book, which was just a book of problems. It was just, there wasn't even instructional text. It was just, hey, here are 200 pages of geometry problems. His books were removed from libraries around the country and from every single State Department library around the world. And all that did was hurt people who needed to learn geometry. Like, it didn't serve any end. But and also, I mean, it's pretty obvious why that happened, right? It's not like anyone sat down and said, well, we want to make sure that there's no subversive material. It's that at a certain bureaucratic level, someone just said, okay, here's a list of people who have been found in contempt of Congress and for, in regards to communist activity. And we're just going to take that list and we're just going to get rid of all their books. It doesn't really matter the content, right? And so you get ridiculous results like this. And it's not that different from, I mean, sort of a funny parallel with the way that there are these lists of words that have been stripped out of, Defense Department websites. And because gay is one of them, we end up with the Enola Gay, the bomber, which is, I mean, I'm just going to say it, not gay.
Yeah.
But it was removed. And again, not because anyone sat down and said, well, we can't let the Enola Gay in here because that's just bureaucratic stupidity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but also that's a consequence of this kind of fear mongering, right?
Yeah.
Better safe than sorry. Let's just use the list and take a hammer to everything.
And isn't that a way also of like dehumanizing people by saying, like, if you have a person that's a communist and they're a good actor, or you have a person who's a communist and they're a good musician, or you have a person that's a communist that just teaches math, something that has nothing to do with anything as far as like their political beliefs go, just it humanizes them to be a teacher, to be a very good teacher. As you pointed out, he was one of the best teachers at that time in his lane. So when you have these books and stuff and you want to get rid of them, it's almost in a way saying, if I allow people to see this, they'll know that this is just another person, and it may make them more willing to listen.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's erasure, right? Mm-hmm. It's let's get rid of, let's just get this person out of the public sphere. And that means getting rid of their names on books. It means removing them from their jobs and making sure that they can't get employment. Not only in teaching, he had a hard time finding a job for years after that, simply because he had been added to this list. So yeah, it's absolutely dehumanizing. It is this idea that once you're in a certain category, that the powers that be have defined. Once you're in that category, anything can be done to you, right? Mm-hmm. I think of the Mahmoud Khalil case. The fact that we have, there are millions of permanent resident aliens in the United States, but the government, not me, but the government has decided that if those people fit into a certain box, then their rights don't matter anymore, right? And of course, the government has said, well, we get to declare what that is. So they are a national security threat. Why? Well, we don't have to say that, but we have the absolute power to say that they are. He is a Hamas radical or Hamas sympathizing radical. Well, prove it. Where's the proof? And the Supreme Court has ruled pretty clearly that look, if you are sympathetic with a belief, that is not the same thing as being a part of that belief. If you are sympathetic with, say, Hamas, now this was an important case during the Red Scare. Just because you sympathize with an organization, and just because you maybe work with an organization occasionally, that doesn't mean that you are an affiliate. That doesn't mean you're a part of that organization, or certainly you're not a member. And so the idea that simply because he has said things that overlap with things that Hamas has said, and I'm not endorsing those views, but I'm just saying that's part of the point, right? Is someone doesn't have to say something that everyone else agrees with. The point is that there are people who have all kinds of points of view, and sometimes very unpopular points of view. But at the minute where the government starts to say, if you have this view, then you are in this box, and we are allowed to do all sorts of things to you that under any other circumstance we would never be allowed to do. We can go to your home, grab you in the middle of the night, take you in shackles to a prison in Louisiana, not let you talk to your lawyers in private, not let you talk to your family, not charge you with anything, and start proceedings to deport you simply because we've decided, with reasons we don't have to explain, that you are a national security threat. And when it happens to people like Khalil, who is not a citizen, but is a green card holder, it's a very thin line between that. And in fact, I actually don't know what the line is. Why, given that green card holders, according to the Congress, or according to Congress, according to the Constitution and the Supreme Court, many times, green card holders have all the rights of citizens. So they can't vote, but they have all the rights of, have all the civil liberties,
liberties, yeah,
of a citizen. And once the government says, well, no, that's not true, we get to decide which ones have that, then I don't understand. I don't see where the line, what prevents them from saying that about citizens.
Yeah, and a couple things to that point. Yeah, you make so many good points. I'm like, I have so many responses.
Sorry.
No, you do great. It's you have such a great knowledge base for this, and like I said, I was very excited for this because this is something that I'm interested in as well. Khalil's a great example because that line that you're speaking of is easily blurred by fear of the other. So when you use immigrants as the person that you want to create as your study case for getting rid of, so even if he has a green card and such, it's just blurred enough to use it as a test to see how much further you can push that. And as we know, during the Red Scare also, there was college protests that were also vilified, and the government came out and said, look, we need to put a stop to this. This is un-American. This is unpatriotic for you to be like this. And if we have to, we may start taking away some of those liberties. And that's what we're seeing in Khalil's case.
Yeah, and Khalil, just to add on to that, Khalil's case is very similar to the case of Harry Bridges, who was one of the really great figures in American labor in the 20th century. He was the leader of the longshoremen on the West Coast, and a very radical figure, definitely more radical than most, and more outspoken than a lot of the mainstream labor leaders. But he was also very effective, and very much his members loved him. There's remains a debate: was he ever a communist? To some extent, it may not matter. He certainly affiliated with the communists. He agreed with a lot of what communists said, and he valued what they were trying to do. As a result, the government tried to deport him. And they actually they tried to deport him 4 separate times, even after he got citizenship halfway through all of this. And again, the justification was, here's someone that we don't like. Here's someone that we believe is too radical for our agenda, too radical for sort of the American, I don't know, the commonweal that we believe exists, national security, whatever the terminology was, and it varied. We're going to get rid of him. And when it turned out, when the Supreme Court said, well, no, you can't just get rid of someone because they have beliefs that you don't agree with, Congress passed a law that said, if you are in the Smith Act in 1940, if you are someone who has affiliated, and this is a vague term, right? As I mentioned, if you're someone who's affiliated with a group like the communists, then you can be deported. And the Smith Act is very dangerous for that reason, because not only does it require all alien residents after 30 days, basically if you're not a tourist, to register with the federal government, and then you're on a list. And if you have been found at some point to have some questionable thing in your background, then it's the government can very quickly move in and start deportation proceedings. And what I think is very scary, and you see this with the Khalil case, is there are a lot of people, not just in the administration, but millions of Americans who do believe that someone like Khalil is a second-class citizen simply because he is not literally a full citizen. He doesn't have full citizenship. And there's undoubtedly racial elements to it, but it's also just this political categorization. And that's very scary because that's not how it works. And that's not how civil liberties work in the United States. Once you are here with legal status, you are protected by the Constitution. You are allowed to say things. That's why over our history, so many people have tried desperately to come to the United States as refugees, as immigrants coming from other countries that do not respect civil liberties, that do not have these protections. And we have always been better because of that. And we have had an immense, when you talk about America's impact on the world, one of the positives has been the model, right? Us standing up and saying, yes, we respect the civil liberties of all kinds of people. And it's not just people who believe in America. You can come to America and you can say every day that you hate America. And as long as you are speaking and you're expressing your point of view, that's fine. To people in dictatorships or less free countries, that's insane. And yet, why would you want anything less? But you have to be able to tolerate and respect and accept that and maybe argue with it. But that's where we should be as a country. And it's where we weren't as a country during the Red Scare. And I think already it's where we're not as a country today.
Yeah. And that's why I enjoyed the book so much is when you talk about Khalil once again, when they say we've detained him, we have not arrested, we've detained, you get into this place where it's like, well, you might be okay with that right now because you say you're even on the left and you support Israel and you say, hey, I don't like his ideas. And this is one of the things I think is pretty scary about the Red Scare is how you had people that generally would be standing up and supporting these people that chose not to because they were afraid to be seen as being one of these people. So you have somebody like Khalil, if you're a person on the left right now and you're saying, well, hey, look, I don't support, I might support his free speech, but I don't support what he's saying. So whatever happens to him, that's his fault. Well, don't forget, like you are also likely to be impacted by that. And that's why it's important for people to stand up. And speaking of people that stood up and during this time, you also mentioned in the book Earl Warren, right? Who really kind of comes in at the end of all this and starts kind of dismantling the Smith Act and starting to push really hard for civil liberties. And of course, he had some things that were kind of bad that he had talked about. And I think that what we saw with Warren coming through is that if we have the right people, and right now, strangely enough, I'm looking at Amy, I always mess up her name.
Amy Coney Barrett.
Coney Barrett. We're looking at Amy Coney Barrett, and we're potentially seeing this person that might, because of her proclivity to the constitutional law, be willing to stand up against some of these things that happen. John Roberts just came out and also admonished Donald Trump for Elon Musk talking about impeaching judges and stuff like that. Do you see the same hope for this time in those people that I'm seeing?
Well, I think there's no choice. You have to have hope in the judicial system. During the Red Scare, the judicial system failed until it succeeded, right? I mean, there were so many aspects of the legal judicial world that simply stood away. The ACLU was a non-entity in this fight. And in fact, again, sort of similar to the Khalil parallel, the ACLU often would say, well, look, we defend people, but we're not going to defend communists. They don't believe in our system of government. Well, this is what happens. Major law firms. There were a few law firms that did stand up. Arnold and Porter is a great example. But a lot of other law firms simply said, we can't take the heat, or we don't agree with we agree in principle, but we don't agree with these people. The American Bar Association kicked out members. It actually admonished Earl Warren for one of his decisions, and he quit. He said, I don't need you. But you're right that, look, Warren was one of the facilitators of the internment of Japanese residents and Japanese Americans during World War II. He was part of a gross violation of civil liberties. And, he always sort of caged that and said, well, look, it was wartime, it was different. But I think the later Earl Warren would never have said that, even though he never really said he was sorry. But when he got to the Supreme Court, and he was known as a law and order guy, very pro-police, pro-FBI, not the person you would think would be a stand-up civil liberties guy, but he got to the Supreme Court and he started thinking about things differently. In Warren's case, I think it's really important that he had never been a judge. He had always been he had always been a lawyer for the government. He was always a prosecutor, attorney general, and then governor. So he's a politician as well. He just came at the question separately and ultimately sort of looked at things in terms of fairness and justice as we would understand it. There are other justices, particularly Felix Frankfurter, who, were academics, who didn't think that Warren was very smart, who thought that Warren was kind of a hayseed. But the fact is that Warren understood the issues more clearly than anyone else. But one of the reasons they didn't like him was because he suddenly became this guy once he was on the bench that they didn't think he would be. And I think it's important also to see his position on the Red Scare as coterminous. It happened around the same time as his commitment to desegregation of schools. And again, there was legal arguments all around it. Could the government come in and force schools to desegregate? Warren believed it could, but he also said, look, fundamentally, this is unjust. And we can't be a country that tolerates injustice simply because 9 men on a bench decide that that's fair, or decide that that's okay. And, fundamentally, he had an appreciation for the institutions and an appreciation for what the Constitution was there to protect. And not about simply calling balls and strikes, but also fundamentally preserving lowercase l liberal institutions. And that's what judges are supposed to do, right? Even conservative judges. And I'd like to think that Roberts and Barrett, at least, are of that same mindset. That, yes, I mean, they're going to vote for deregulation and they're going to vote for, they may be anti-abortion, they may be, in favor of loosening rules around prayer in schools. But when it comes to, and I don't mean to demean those, but when it comes to things like civil liberties and in this very particular way, right? Not just civil liberties generally, but the encroachment of the executive branch and the demonstrable desire by the executive branch to become the be-all and end-all of what civil liberties are, what the lines are, and who crosses them. Then I think it gets really dangerous, because that's not just a different take on the rule of law. That is the erasure of the rule of law. And I'd like to think that at least those two justices understand that those are the stakes.
Yeah, and we're supposed to have, obviously, the way our government is set up, obviously Congress is supposed to, play tug of war with the executive branch for that power. And obviously right now we're not seeing that. And when, the judicial, as you pointed out during the Red Scare, chose to kind of go with the status quo of what McCarthyism was telling him was the important thing for America, for national security, we're seeing more now that, and I don't know if it's specifically because of how many federal judges Biden pushed through in the end, or how many were Obama or Clinton appointees before that, or even Bush appointees, to be honest with you, as this new type of conservatism, which is really just an older McCarthyism type of conservatism. We're now seeing that even some conservatives are saying, like, hold on, this isn't how we're supposed to do this. But I want to kind of go back to something about the Trump-McCarthy parallels, because this actually just happened the other day, or maybe it was today. Carrie Lake being in charge of America's Voice. McCarthy attacked America's Voice. McCarthy attacked the newspapers. McCarthy attacked journalists. He gave them insulting nicknames. McCarthy did a lot of things during his time that you can almost directly parallel to Donald Trump today. Do you agree? Or maybe you can explain to me, what is the importance of somebody like McCarthy or Trump attacking the voice of America?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's no coincidence, right? The Voice of America is set up as a nonpartisan, objective news source that is funded by the government, and yet is out there in the world, not domestically, but out there in the world, projecting not just America's values, and we're not there, or it's not there really to do that, but it's to demonstrate what some of those values mean, right? So the freedom of the press, the importance of objectivity in reporting, the importance of holding power to holding power accountable. This is what the media was supposed to do in the United States. It's not what the media does in a lot of other countries. And so Voice of America is there to do that. In that way, it's also willing to say things that are not all that great about certain politicians or the president, not because they're editorializing, but because they do things that are unpopular. They make mistakes. They do things that are not legal. And so both McCarthy and Trump understood that this was a potential source of resistance to what they were doing. McCarthy said, "Well, Voice of America is full of communists, and this is a great way to go after them." I think for him, it was more just the fact that it was the press. I'm not sure he ever had a very strong understanding of what Voice of America did. It was just an example of the press, and it was a way for him to go after the press and hopefully make other reporters a little more malleable. Because he did have his favorite reporters, just like Trump does have his partisans. And when he talks about the media and the evil media, he's not talking about them. He's talking about, well, frankly, people like me and people who work for the New York Times or for The Guardian or Mother Jones. And, McCarthy did the same thing. And he was very good at manipulating the media, but also at the same time, like you said, vilifying the media. And the ultimate reason why that's important is that when people hear bad things about McCarthy, or about Trump, they discount it.
Yeah. And that leads into my next question, because was it Murrow? Was he the reporter?
Murrow,
yeah, right. With what happened with McCarthy, I believe that McCarthy started this idea that we have today. This, we have some kind of fundamental beliefs among the citizenry. You've heard most of these before. My vote doesn't matter. The all politicians are corrupt. And now you're hearing you cannot believe anything you hear in legacy media. And of course, most people, if you ask them to define legacy media, just like if you ask them to define woke or any of these other kind of keywords that get them like buzzed up and hyped up to be angry, they can't really explain to you exactly what they mean. They just, these people that are controlled by oftentimes Jewish people or something else of that sort. Do you think that there's a possibility of seeing a Murrow type that could rise to the occasion like he did with McCarthy? Or do you think we're past that as a people?
Well, I hold out the hope for the possibility. Let me explain why. And I think obviously courage is part of it. And Murrow was a very courageous person. But the reason why Murrow was successful was he saw that McCarthy was very good at manipulating the print media and to some extent radio. He was very good at going to certain reporters that he knew were hungry and wanted scoops. He understood deadlines and the way deadlines worked. And he would approach people, with 15, 20 minutes left before the deadline. And he would say something just insanely outrageous. I am going to drop the biggest news bomb tomorrow morning. It's going to be about the State Department. I'm going to reveal the biggest spy network you've ever seen. Now, the reporter was faced with a dilemma. Embodying that reporter, I don't have the time to go check this. I can't make a bunch of phone calls. I basically have to print what he says. Now, I know that if I print what he says, it's going to be on the front page. and I will be praised by my bosses. If I don't, and because I'm kind of skeptical of what he's saying, well, someone else is going to get it. They're going to get the scoop, and my bosses, at least for a little while, are going to be angry with me. More often than not, those reporters would just take what he said. And by the time the next day rolled around, McCarthy might never even do anything he had said he would do, or if he did, it would be empty and a complete sort of, non-event. But by then he would have moved on, and you would just do this again. Now, Murrow is very important. Murrow was a TV guy, and Murrow understood how TV worked and the power of the image in a way that McCarthy didn't. Most people in America, by the time Murrow and he spent years building up this documentary, clip after clip of McCarthy. By the time he debuted that in 1954, most Americans had never actually seen McCarthy, in anything other than photographs.
Mhm.
They didn't, his boorishness, his bullying. It's one thing to read it in print, but to actually see it. And Murrow wasn't just clipping, a few sentences at a time. He was really kind of giving a lot of, these clips go on. And you can really see just how empty McCarthy is. And then he ran that, and it was incredibly powerful and very, very effective. And it also mattered that there was someone else who did something very similar. Right around that same time was what was called the Army McCarthy hearings. And it's a lot of detail, but essentially it pitted the Army against McCarthy. And so there's a congressional hearing that a lot of people cast as a trial. It wasn't a trial, but it sort of had that setup. And they brought in a lawyer to represent the military, the Army. And his name was Joe Welch, and he was an older lawyer from Boston, was not someone that a lot of people knew much about, was not someone who, if you looked at him, would necessarily think, oh, he's going to be this master of the courtroom. But he understood one thing really, really well, and that was that it wasn't a courtroom, and that it was going to be televised, and that millions of Americans would be watching this, and they wouldn't really understand a lot of the details. They wouldn't really care about it. They were watching for the performance. That fundamentally, that television series, as it were, I mean, it went on for months, this proceedings, that it was theater, performance. And he very meticulously baited McCarthy over and over, and finally got him to go after one of his assistants in a really mean way, for everyone to watch. And then he sprung his trap. And we all, I think, famously, one of the most famous quotes from not just the Red Scare, but from post-war culture. At long last, have you no sense of decency? It's a long oration that Welch clearly had prepared. I mean, he always said it was spontaneous. I'm sure there was no script, but it's also very clear that he's been waiting to say this. In fact, there's an apocryphal story that, he was teary-eyed and it was very emotional.
Yep.
And after that, there was a break. The chairman gavelled everything to an end. And as he was walking out of the courtroom, a couple of people said, he looked at me and he had a little tear in his eye. But there was also a glimmer. There's a little. He knew what he had done, and he had won. And I think both of those guys, both Murrow and Welch, understood what television meant and how television worked. They understood that newspapers were, as important as newspapers were, they were the old model. And they were never going to get McCarthy with that. They had to use this new medium that many people still didn't understand what it meant in the culture, how to use it. So this is a long way of answering your question, which is, I think if someone does come along and, is the Edward R. Murrow or the Joseph Welch of the 2020s, it's going to be someone who's unfortunately not a reporter like me, not a conventional reporter. It could be Instagram influencer. It could
Mm-hmm.
be, you know, a YouTuber. It could be a politician who understands how to use it. It could be a business person. I mean, it could be all sorts of people, especially, you know, these days, anybody can be a presence on the internet, but the
Yep.
ones who are really effective understand how it's different and new. And so it's going to be someone like that. But I don't know what that's going to look like, right? I mean, if I did, I'd be a rich man because I'd be making all kinds of bets.
Yeah.
But I do think that it's going to be, we're not going backward. We're
Mm-hmm.
not going back to the politics and the media of the pre-Trump era. We need to, anybody interested in resisting, if that's what they want to do,
Mm-hmm.
they need to be figuring out what that looks like today and going forward.
Yeah. And when you say TV was a new format, we can also posit the internet in its place, right? We can take it and we can position it in its place. The internet of today, even though it's been around for a while, we still have a lot of people that don't understand media literacy when it comes
Yeah.
to the internet and what clickbait is. A lot of the people that follow me are, 45, 50 year older, right? They're my age. They're people
Mhm.
that are interested in the things that I talk about. And much like myself, sometimes we have some technical difficulties with the internet. And you answered my question, and that is, I think as well, when you look at Welcher, obviously Morrow was well known, but it was a different era, and he was really well respected for his coverage of World War II, and he kind of
Mhm.
entered the hearts of Americans. But during the Army trial, you had a person who was pretty much unknown to the majority of people. And I just recently said this on another show I was on. I said, times like this, people that choose to resist, people that choose to speak up, are very important, because you might think you have this really small voice, but you don't know who it is going to be that's going to have the largest voice until it happens. So
Yeah.
people, whoever comes out, and I do agree. I think when we look at certain people, I'm from California, so Gavin Newsom, you start to become a little concerned. Schumer recently, with
Mhm.
a bit of capitulation, a bit of that reaching across to try and say, well, what they did is calling us out for some of the stuff that maybe we believe, that maybe not the majority of America believes. And they start to capitulate. And what it's going to take is somebody that doesn't have that concern, somebody not running
Yeah.
for the presidency of the United States.
Yeah, yeah, or who, you know, may see a different path
Mm-hmm.
than the one in the past. I mean, look, I'm a very center of the road guy. I'm, you know, you know, I was raised in an era when you were taught, you know, whether or not you were a centrist, that there were good people on both sides of the
Mm-hmm.
aisle. You know, that there were well-intentioned conservatives, well-intentioned liberals, even far out to the wings, that we were all kind of invested in the same project. And that as a result, give and take and compromise and conversation were the bedrock of how politics worked in America. And that still has a lot of appeal. And I understand why some of our political leaders, particularly in the Democratic Party, would, that is their response.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think that, I mean, just as an observer, I don't think that that really is the way things work. It's certainly not the way things work on the Republican side.
Yep.
And that's just a fact. I mean, they just are now playing a different political game than the left, or the liberals,
Mm-hmm.
the Democrats. And it's I think the tough question going forward, especially for the Democratic Party, is, well, these are, you know, compromise and bipartisanship, and these are things we still value. I mean, maybe
Mm-hmm.
not everybody, but certainly Schumer. I think that's fair to say that's his kind of bread and butter. And that is just, but what is the alternative, right? And I think that's when you looking at Schumer, trying to go through, and the most sympathetic reading of watching him try to deal with this continuing resolution crisis, was, well, okay, if I'm not going to do my playbook, what's the other playbook? I don't understand. You know, he just was not able to really wrap his head around what does that look like? What does a Democratic version of the Republican playbook look like? And how is that not insanely destructive to our political culture? And younger people, by and large, I mean, I don't mean to make it a age thing, but I'd say generally speaking, younger members of Congress and a lot of people around him, but also Nancy Pelosi, so not an age thing at all, clearly see a different calculation. And they seem to say, look, the important part is to understand that your, Chuck Schumer, your politics, your political playbook is dust. It's gone. And that may suck. That may be terrible. But it is not going to get us anywhere. And if anything, it's just going to undermine the party. Now, Chuck Schumer may be right that it's a pretty dark road ahead. And in a world where all we have are two political parties that refuse to talk to each other and are just completely committed to winning and destroying the other one at all costs, that's not a good situation. But it's a better situation than having one party that sees things that way and another party that is continually trying to compromise because that's what they were trained to do. So, it's I think the country is in a very dark place aside from the headlines and the news. Every day there's a horror story, but this political crisis where we are of how do we govern in a democratic way when neither party is willing to compromise on anything, and the leadership of each party is well, I wouldn't even say this about the Democrats, but certainly the Republicans, the leadership is held is constrained and held really imprisoned by some pretty aggressive wingers, who demand, who are willing to completely throw everything out the window if they don't get what they want. So there's that internal within each party or within the Republican Party. I think the Democrats actually are much more willing to work with each other. It's not like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez hates Chuck Schumer and will not work with him unless he does everything she wants. She's a very savvy politician who has values and goals and principles, and they're different from Schumer's, but she's clearly somebody who will work with the leadership. But she seems to think, and I think there's good reason, that has failed. And so I don't know. I mean, I could probably ramble like this for a while, but but I do think it's frightening, and in that regard is somewhat different from the Red Scare, because the Red Scare you certainly had for a while during the McCarthy portion, especially. You did have a lot of otherwise centrist, fairly reasonable Republicans who were either unwilling to stand up to McCarthy or kind of agreed with him enough to go along with him. And you had a lot of Democrats who were either afraid of him or just weren't playing by McCarthy's playbook. But at the end of the day, you did have a pretty solid core of reasonable people in the Senate and in the House who were committed to working together, and even if they had differences. And that's different than where we are today, and that's what's really scary.
And even with McCarthy, eventually his downfall coming from Eisenhower, a president that cared more about country than party. And one of the things I love about reading books, I have lots of books, right? Is learning things that I don't know or did not know, learning something that disagrees with something that I believed before. And reading that about Eisenhower really, like, I know that Eisenhower worked with the New Deal and he helped expand it. And, maybe my grandfather was 30 years in the Army, so I'm completely supportive of the military and such, but I definitely had some disagreements with some of his politics. And a lot of the 50s and 60s politics. But at the end of the day, he was the downfall. And yeah, you pretty much answered what I was trying to get to there. And that is that Chuck Schumer and the Democrats, still their heart may be in the right place. It's a different world today than it was 20 years ago. It's a different world than it was 8 years ago, 9 years
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah, absolutely.
Donald Trump and what I believe is a parody of, or not even a parody, it's a pretty close parallel of McCarthyism has changed politics. I think Roy Cohn's impact on Trump and his learning from McCarthy and the people that he left behind after he had a huge chip on his shoulder after the Army trials or the Army committee. I think that that's really changed our political atmosphere now. And AOC, who's a great person to use as an example of today's changing politics, her introducing the Green New Deal really kind of speaks to a new attempt by the left to re-embrace Roosevelt's New Deal and take us back to that area. And I think it does come down to, and we have seen a couple conservatives that have chosen to speak out very minutely because they're very scared of being primaried by Elon Musk and his 400 billion or 250, I guess now, $250 billion. It's dropping fast. Poor guy. And I think what we hope to see in there, just to kind of take everything, all the things we were just talking about, we need content creators that used to not be journalists, used to not be interested in politics, that maybe either have small voices or maybe they're big voices, and those people need to come out and they need to work with our journalists, our media, work with our politicians. And one of the things that we saw during the Red Scare was communism really created this rift within the left. You were talking about Harry Bridges. Who's the gentleman that was the Secretary of Agriculture?
Oh, Henry Wallace.
Henry Wallace. His attempt to become the president, where he got attached to the Communist Party and their values, which created this rift where he said, what was the quote? Is something like, if we got rid of them, we'd lose 100,000 votes, but we'd gain 4 million. I think that what we just recently saw with Kamala Harris also in some way is very cyclical, because even though Kamala did not espouse the talking points that the right claims she did, it was very easy for the right to create this rift with the left, specifically on LGBT rights and also with Israel Hamas. So
I think I always find it really interesting that on the left, they are constantly being, I mean, both during the Red Scare and I'd say it many times since then, but especially in the last 20, 30 years, constant leaders on the left, or left of center to the left, are constantly being asked to draw a line. Where's the line between you and everyone to your left? And you have to detach yourself from those people. It happened to Martin Luther King. He was told, you have to disavow everybody to the left of you. It certainly happened, in the Clinton era. And Clinton was famously, his Sister Soldier moment, where he went after this rapper as a proxy for what was considered at the time Black radicalism. And the same thing today, right? People blaming Harris for not distancing herself more from certain elements of the left. And look, tactically, maybe that's what was necessary. But I think there's a real an asymmetry in our politics, because people don't ask that of the right. You see coalitions, and of course you see tensions, but you don't see very often Republican leaders being asked, hey, you need to distance yourself. You need to publicly disavow the right to life movement. You need to publicly disavow immigration hardliners, whatever it is. You need to and there's just an acceptance. And I think it's, sort of admirable on the right that they understand there are all kinds of, coalitions and going to be disagreements, but ultimately they work together. But I think what's really interesting is that the public holds them to different standards. We're blaming Harris for not coming out and having her own Sister Soldier moment with, say, a trans activist. why no one says that about Donald Trump? No one asked that of other politicians on the right in their own, whatever their own sort of situation would be. We don't hold them to account for not denouncing, some Klan member who endorsed them.
Mm-hmm. David Duke.
And yeah, I mean, look, in 1980, Ronald Reagan was the John Birch Society endorsed Reagan,
Mm-hmm.
and Reagan was asked, "Hey, you were endorsed by the John Birch Society. Are you going to disavow them?" And Reagan said, "Look, I don't agree with them, but that doesn't mean they can't agree with me. So
Mm-hmm.
no, I'm not going to disavow them. Yeah, if they want to vote for me, great. That's more votes." And he didn't lose. I mean,
Oh no, he won by a lot.
He trounced Carter. But if someone had asked that of Harris, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, effectively, she was asked that question, and she gave the right answer, which was, "Look, I'm, not going to disavow trans activists.
Mm-hmm.
I want their votes." She was punished for that. I mean, in the media and in the political class. Why didn't you denounce them? I don't know. It's an interesting, I don't know why it works that way, but it's an interesting sort of dynamic in American politics.
Yeah, I heard after the campaign was over, I heard her one of her campaign managers in an interview say, the way that you win presidencies, the way you win elections is by playing between the 45s. And I thought,
Yeah.
Man, that's what's wrong with the left right there. I
Well,
was like,
yeah.
right there. They don't know that the right has taken the ball all the way to the end zone, and they're playing
Yeah.
between your 20 and their end zone. And
Yeah.
the left's over here trying to play between the 45s in an attempt to bring over what they see as voters that potentially can see, the problems from Trump. And maybe in 2020 we saw that with Biden, but it had been a little too long. I keep saying this about this current Trump presidency is I think people look back on the 2017 to 2021 term and they don't realize that there were certain people in his cabinet, certain people that he had surrounded himself that maybe we had never thought would be guardrails on him, that maybe we
Yeah.
even thought too poorly of. But people like Mike Pence, I mean, I like
Pence.
Mattis, but General Mattis, Milley, many people that said, "Hey, you can't do that. You're going to destroy the country. Like we can't do that," and that's missing from this here. So
Absolutely.
what I would ask about that is, we obviously, in my opinion, have encountered a right-wing Republican Party that either full-on believes in the McCarthy plan of causing the fear, the hatred, the anger, the fear of the other, and even the ones that maybe don't embrace that, they have no way to get away from it, because if they do, they'll be left out in the cold and potentially they won't have a job. Is there anything you think from the Red Scare time that people today can take to have hope? Because obviously, like I said, at the end, Eisenhower really did come through. Earl Warren did come through. Like, is there anything that you think that people can take from that?
Well, I mean, I think, a theme that we've hit on a lot is you never know where things are going to come from. And to think that Eisenhower, and I wouldn't put Eisenhower, I don't consider him really a hero so much in the story as just a bulwark.
Mm-hmm.
His views were naturally establishment, and were, he didn't put himself out there necessarily in any great glory, but, he, at certain times, he said the right things, and he denounced his censorship at the right moment, and he very sort of subtly went after McCarthy. Could he have done it earlier? Perhaps. He instituted security, a loyalty or a security program that that did hurt a lot of federal employees, but he also drew a line in the sand and made it clear that there was a point outside which he was not going to accept a lot of Red Scare, red baiting, and I think really ultimately helped bring it to an end in doing so. I think a little more highly of Earl Warren and Joe Welch and Edward R. Murrow. But the point is that these are all figures who, when this all started, you would not have necessarily seen coming, and they all sort of operated in different different sort of quadrants. So that's one point of hope. I mean, another is, this is very naive, and probably the thing that if anyone wanted to come after me, this would be the statement, pie in the sky. But I do think that our politics, and maybe the American character in a vague, naive way, we don't really do demagogues for very long. And we don't do, in as much as, yes, we do have these periods where we embrace and either tolerate or participate in witch hunts and demonization. We also, that's not a standing condition. We pull back from that. And so I think there's some optimism there. The big asterisk, aside from whether that's true or not, but I believe it, but the big asterisk is, are we at a moment where it doesn't matter? The American public could revolt at the voting booth in 2026 against Trumpism, and nothing will happen, right? Maybe the Democrats take back Congress and Trump just rules as he always has and challenges the courts and Congress to do something about it. That's we may get to a constitutional crisis of major proportions long before that, but that certainly is one. And then what happens in 2028, right? So I don't know if that's a really hopeful thing to say, but I do think that there is something to be said about the fact that ultimately people, they don't like demagogues. They don't want a lot of noise in their life around politics. Some people do. Most people don't. Most people just want the government to work efficiently. They want it to work where they need it to work, and otherwise they want it out of their lives. And they want politics out of their lives. They don't really care about what's going on in Washington. And, aside from the hardcore politicos and the hardcore MAGA types, I do think that the vast majority of Americans are going to get tired of what's going on, and they're going to start to make choices. And we're just going to have to see where that goes. So I think we are in uncharted territories, and fingers crossed that it turns out well.
Yeah, I always explain what you're just saying about the want of politics out of your life. Obviously, with Biden, some of the biggest, recriminations outside of the handling of the Israel war was he's boring. He doesn't give any speeches. He doesn't come out and do anything that cool. And I said, I think what America went through is they had a girlfriend, and she was really crazy. And she did a lot of crazy stuff in 2017 to 2000, and she keyed their car and stole their cat. And when Biden came around, it was like, you know what? Actually, I think I'm ready to settle down. I think I want a girl that wants to have a steady job and just maybe buy a house, have some kids. And they got 4 years into that, and they're like, you know what? Actually, she wasn't that bad. She was crazy, but let's give it another shot. And I think that's like I said, I could talk to you for hours because how many of these things are so interesting. But I think that's our culture. Trump is the epitome of what we have became over the past 30 years, between WWE, which Trump was involved in, degeneration culture, the Jerry Springer type of culture, the 4chan type of culture that has led people to want to find some type of entertainment and lives that have kind of devolved into getting up every day and going to work and lacking a real purpose or meaning surrounding the things that they do. And I think Trump fills that void for him, but I think he fills it a little too much. Yeah,
I think you're right. And we're just going to have to see if that's enough.
Yeah. One question I like to ask all the authors, what's the most interesting thing you learned while researching for the book?
Oh man, this is going to get into the book, but one thing that was a lot of fun was I spent time at Stanford University. The archives at the Hoover Institution are full of documentation from the blacklist and the Hollywood blacklist. And one of the things that I learned was that there was the blacklist. So there was no official blacklist, but the idea was everyone knew which actors and which writers and directors were not to be hired by the studios. But that there was also another system that was sort of a clearance operation, or sort of if you were on the blacklist, you would then go to get a lawyer who was vetted by this network of anti-communist sort of clearance agents. I mean, they were like inquisitors, and you would then be directed to, how do you proceed? Maybe you need to go to the FBI and go testify in front of Congress. At the very least, you had to write a letter. And you had to write a letter that essentially just laid yourself out and said, I am so sorry. I made all these mistakes, enumerate the mistakes. And then your letter would be read by these self-defined interrogators or inquisitors. And if they decided that you were okay, then they would tell the studio executives, take this person off the blacklist. And I read, there's so many letters from famous Vincent Price, John Ford, Lena Horne, and they were depressing to read because these are celebrities, and I think people who generally have pretty good reputations, but here they are just demeaning themselves in the hopes of getting their career saved because they happen to be on some list. And really what was going on was this sort of extortion racket where, people would show up on these, show up on the blacklist, be put there by some of the same folks who then acted as their judges, I guess, to decide whether they could be taken off the list. And it's just the level, I guess that's what really fascinated me, was the takeaway from all this is just the level of degradation and the demeaning, the self-demeaning that went on in Hollywood in order just to save your reputation. And I mean, I understand that it's your livelihood, but what the amount of garbage that you were forced to eat, the things you had to say about yourself and about your friends, just to be accepted by people that you probably hated, and certainly had no interest in your career, were mostly interested in their own career. To me, that just spoke volumes about what the Red Scare was about. And the fact that all of this was happening in Hollywood. I mean, it's not like it's a national security issue. It's just because these are celebrities and we're going to treat them like garbage, and because we can. And just that level of abuse and the fact that it went on for so long, I don't know, just fascinated me. And I spend a good amount of time in the book talking about this, and some of the particular people who were dragged into it and what they felt afterward. Just to drag this on a little longer, but the one character I thought was fascinating in this was Sterling Hayden, who is remembered Jack D. Ripper in Dr. Strangelove. He was the corrupt police chief in The Godfather. He had become a communist because he was a OSS operative in Yugoslavia during World War II. But he dropped out of the party because he realized it was bunk. But he was targeted and he was blacklisted, potentially. And he had to go in front of Congress and name names. And, later, and he writes about this, his memoir, Wanderer, is worth reading. It's so good. He's a phenomenal writer. And he talks about just how broken the whole thing was, the whole process, how broken he was by it. And he went on to some great roles. He was, his best career was in front of him. But he said, I'll never be able to communicate how much I hate myself because of what I did. And that just, I don't know, that just brought to a point what the whole book is about. It's on a certain level, the book is about politics. It's about Cold War. It's about espionage. But when it comes down to it, it's about self-respect, about communal respect, civic values, all of these things breaking down. And in some ways, it's a very human story. And it's something that I hope people take away more than anything else from the book.
Nice. Very well said. That's and I did. That's what I took away from it was that humanness of, in my opinion, the hope is that people will realize at one point or another how gross it feels to do this to each other, and that'll cause them to pull back.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, why don't we have you tell us where people can find your book and where they can find more information about you?
Well, Red Scare can be found at all the usual spots, obviously on Amazon or barnesandnoble.com. Buy it there if you'd like. I encourage everybody to buy books from bookshop.org. It supports local bookstores. And if you live in a community with a local bookstore, I encourage you to go there and buy it. There's nothing like supporting your local bookstore, and we need them more than ever. And you can get an ebook version online, which you can also buy through bookshop.org. And there's an audio version. And check it out however you want. And hopefully you'll enjoy it.
Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please like and subscribe and hit that notification bell, and check out that video on the screen now.